To think that the Buckeyes are a beastly, cultureless people, their native Ohio a fetid hellscape. After all, they managed to set a river on fire a few times, and that takes a measure of doing. Michiganders, basically, are a sound bunch. But as my only memorable experience with Ohio had been the actual fetid hellscape of the state's turnpike, I thought it best to explore the place for myself. The order of the day was a museum-to-museum run from the edge of Lake Erie down to the flats of Dayton. The museums in question? The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. The Hall of Fame opens at 10 a.m., the Air Force Museum closes at 5 p.m. Just over 200 miles separate them. If I were to see both and do so in proper style, I'd need a steed to fit the mission. Something fast, glamorous, and a little preposterous, preferably with some semblance of aviation history. The Mercedes-AMG S65 Cabriolet fit the bill nicely, a four-place convertible with a V12 and a $250,000 price tag. She had a point. While the S65 Coupe is a pure shot of highly refined testosterone, the convertible roof adds a gender-bending quality. If Ziggy Stardust flew in today, they'd descend one of these for him. If Lady Gaga doesn't already own one, we'd be shocked if an S-Cab isn't on order. Slade's Dave Hill could drive this car, and nobody would bat an eye. Conversely, a half-dressed mook with a decent haircut could also look right at home, if he's comfortable enduring derision for perpetrating a measure of affect. Plutocrats for a classless society, we've found your chariot. It's got 621 horsepower, churns out 738 pounds-to-foot of torque, bolts to 60 miles per hour in 4.1 seconds, and clears the quarter mile in 12.3 at 120 miles per hour. Putting the serenity and guts to use, I headed for Columbus, which I'd heard from friends is a pretty swell town. Notably, this praise comes from New Yorkers, not Michiganders. In my Californian ignorance, the only thing I know about Columbus is that Family Ties was set in its suburbs, and Alex P. Keaton really seemed more like an E-Class sedan sort of guy. I stayed just long enough to fill the tank, which the V12 sucks dry to the tune of 16 miles per gallon, and put my foot down for Dayton. Birthplace of aviation. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, which we covered extensively in this photo feature, sits on the right field portion of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Its runway services the final flights of aircraft inbound for display. JFK's Air Force One made its last landing here, as did the C-141A Hanoi Taxi Comet plane that brought American POWs home from Vietnam, then went on to serve through the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. There were planes in the place I'd waited practically my whole life to see, aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The museum is stocked with aircraft that blew my mind as an aviation-obsessed elementary school kid, like the YF-12A, the interim step between the CIAS 812 Oxcart and the aviation world's equivalent of the Lamborghini Countach, the SR-71 Blackbird. The 812 is basically an SR-71 armed with missiles. At the age of 8, you just knew that the only thing better than a Blackbird was an armed Blackbird. After leaving the museum, I found myself trundling down a narrow road under a canopy of trees, following the signs to Huffman Prairie Flying Field. I'd read about the place in David McCulloch's The Wright Brothers. After Orville and Wilbur made history at Kitty Hawk, they returned to Dayton to further refine their flying machines, testing them in a large pasture owned by Torrance Huffman. The field was open and serene, impossibly lush in a way that California only really sees in March. Away from the somber aura that pervades the Air Force Museum, Huffman Prairie holds the same sort of relevant hush that you find at the MP Bonneville Salt Flats, a fundamental quiet baked into its being despite having been shot through by mechanized history. It's where two brothers clambered into the sky and made flight a viable thing. The Wrights' work at Kill Devil Hills proved a hypothesis. Huffman Prairie was the spot where flying became something that people actually did. Car enough? As I hopped on I-75 and headed north for Detroit, the smooth hum of the 12-hole ingot under the S65's hood thrust us ever forward, the sun dipping low off the port side. I dropped the top and the radio spun up the psychedelic furs, pretty in pink, the superior original album version, not the overproduced, sax-laden rendition from the John Hughes movie soundtrack. Even with the wind whipping through the cabin, Mercedes AirCap anti-buffeting system doesn't work as well here as it did on the E-Class drop top. The hefty Burmester sound system reliably swirled the music up, around, and through me. A great song and an open road in an absolute highway star is a finer experience than all of the Rock Hall, to be sure. Special and yet somehow unpretentious, the big Benz goes about its business without fuss. The S65 Cabriolet remains more automobile than bourgeois bauble. Some say the V8-powered S63 is car enough. To be sure, it's a fine automobile, but you want the full V12 effect. There's no rational reason to spend the extra $77,195, but the additional 4 cylinders somehow complete the machine. At this spending level, the cash is academic, pointing out that one could purchase both an S63 Cabriolet and a Porsche 718 Boxster S for less than the price of an S65 misses the point. After all, the big AMG still undercuts both the Rolls-Royce Dawn and the Bentley Continental GT Speed convertible. The V12 biturbo badge sends parking valets into ecstatic apoplectic fits. Don't make the mistake of taking the S65 Cabriolet as a variant of a lesser car. It's its own machine, one that stands on its own peculiar merits. And as for Ohio, it has best not to believe the Buckeyes' neighbors to the north. A place that gave us Art Arfens, Steve Bators, LeBron James, and Longaberger baskets can hardly be hailed as a one-note void, and indeed, the state is worth a visit. Just give the Rock Hall a miss.